Welcome to this special edition of Hub Hits. I'm Harrison Lowman, managing editor of The Hub, and I'm so pleased today to be joined by Professor Bryce Tingle, the author of Hard Lessons in Corporate Governance. His book has been shortlisted for the Donner Book Prize. The Hub is so happy to be partnering with the Donner Canadian Foundation, spot listing the 5 shortlisted titles and their authors in this series over the next week. Bryce, such a pleasure to have you join us. Thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, the pleasure is mine. Thank you for having me, Harrison.
You're very welcome. Okay, let's get to the heart of this, because I don't think everyone understands this term, kind of a catch-all term. What the heck is corporate governance anyways?
So, corporate governance is the set of rules and norms and regulations around how companies are supposed to organize themselves and sort of do their work. It mostly relates to the rules governing the relationship between shareholders and managers and officers and employees of the company.
And are those rules followed?
You know, in Canada, because we are inclined to be very obedient, we do follow almost all of the rules. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, we can talk about. But when you look at the way Canadian public companies operate, they all basically look exactly the same. All that is required is someone gets an idea about how some aspect of a company ought to run, and all the Canadian companies quickly line up and do it.
Corporate governance in its current form, I think you say, sort of sprung up in the 90s, right? And then expanded. What happened in the 90s?
Well, the intellectual origins are from the 70s. But it takes, 20 years for what happens in university classrooms to leak out into the wider population. What happened in the 90s was that we got very enthusiastic all of a sudden about imposing the theoretical sort of the theory that had developed in the 70s and 80s on companies. And so there was a slight recession, you may remember, in the early 90s. This is the recession that helped bring Bill Clinton into power. In the UK, that recession, plus some bad behavior on the part of some companies, particularly some companies that had been owned by the government and the Thatcher government had taken public, they prompted probably one of the most influential government reports in the history of business, which was the Cadbury Committee, that set out a bunch of rules about how companies ought to run their boards and how they ought to manage themselves. That was followed in Canada by a report the next year called the Day Report, after Peter Day, who was the chair of the committee, and it was a TSX based sort of sponsored report, which essentially adopted the Cadbury Committee's report from the UK. So that's sort of what kicks it off. The other thing that happened was particularly the US government got increasingly interested in seeing if it could micromanage things like executive pay. So they started making tax changes, and the SEC brought in a bunch of disclosure requirements on pay. So all of that begins in the 92, 93 time period, and then just sort of grows.
Bryce,
at the end of the 19... Yeah.
Can I just say to your point about CEO pay, I love this stat. I don't know how much their efforts amounted to, if it amounted to anything at all. Between 1978 and 2012, CEO pay for the largest U.S. companies rose 875%. Is that right?
Yeah.
How the heck does that happen?
Well, what's really funny is it rose that amount exactly during the period when the government and the corporate governance industry was trying to control executive pay. And what's even funnier is everything we tried to control executive pay, the tax changes we made, the pay disclosure we started requiring, the pay consultants we brought in, the independent directors we put on boards, the compensation committees we created as subcommittees of the full board, the say on pay voting that happened. Pretty much every single thing we did to control pay turns out, when you look at the empirical literature, to have actually increased the pay. So
You wonder if
it
we
is,
did nothing, if it would have happened. You say in the
no,
book,
no,
yeah,
we just kept hitting ourselves in the head with a fish.
yeah. Well, this is the thing. You made a sort of cartoon reference there. I think you say, behavior is something like Wile E. Coyote. You try and fail repeatedly to reform something, but it never works. You keep failing. It blows up in your face. You end up with soot on it, and you're left trying again to fail. That's sort of a fair comparison.
Yes, it's absolutely cartoonish what we've done.
Yeah.
I stand by the analogy.
One more cartoon reference. Elia, if you could just pull up his book cover here. You got to make sense of this for me. What is going on in this book cover with the fire around this? Does not look like a happy AGM or whatever that is.
No, it's a board meeting. I it's so first of all, I need to give some credit to I have a brother, Fraser, who is considerably more artistic than I. So this is a picture from 19th century newspaper in which we have added flames. And what I love about the picture is this extremely self-satisfied group of individuals on the board of directors who are confident that everything they're doing is great, but in fact, everything is on fire. And that struck me as an excellent metaphor for a corporate governance experiment.
So today, Bryce, how poor is Canada's corporate health specifically? How much of that fire and flames are still around us?
Well, so there's two ways of looking at that question. One is for companies that are public, that are doing these corporate governance things, how much is it impairing their activities? And the answer there is it's impossible to measure precisely, but probably it's impacting them a bit. It's very expensive. Most of what we do costs money. It's wasteful. It distracts management from what's important. But it's not overwhelming, the economic position of these companies. The second way of looking at it, which I think is the most important way of looking at it, is how much harm is this causing to Canadian public markets? And the answer is a lot. Canadian companies just don't want to go public anymore, where largely because of this stuff we're doing in corporate governance. And as a result, the TSX, our crown jewel in our financial markets, has only slightly more than half the companies it had 15, 20 years ago.
Wow.
And that's a real problem because if Canadian companies don't go public, they frequently sell themselves, and the purchasers are frequently foreign companies located in other countries, especially in industries like tech and pharmaceuticals. So what it means is Canada never comes up with ideas, but we never scale those ideas up into a big business here in the country. And that is probably one of the most serious problems we have economically.
Interesting. Is there a direct link between corporate governance and its spread and Canada's poor labor productivity? We'll look at, it's now what, 70% or so of the US's?
Yeah, there is. The problem for us uniquely in Canada is a scaling problem. We come up with business ideas about the same rate as people in the United States. Our universities generate patents and other measures of productivity at about the same rate as the United States. What we don't do is we don't take these ideas, take these startups, and scale them up to really large companies. That dramatically impacts the amount of business investment that we have in our economy, and it impacts things like the creation of human capital by companies employing thousands of people. So if you sell every good new business you have at, say, when they're between 50 and $100 million, you miss a lot of economic growth. And that's what's going on, largely because what we've done in corporate governance has made our public markets really unpopular with entrepreneurs in this country.
So Canadians good at rules and regulation, less so at innovation.
Yeah, well, actually, we're not terrible at innovation. As I say, if you look at the data, we start companies at about the same rate as the United States. Our companies actually do more per dollar and per capita
And then something happens.
than companies in the US. But what we don't do is we don't create very many Shopifys. We sell these companies when they're still quite small. Usually the purchaser's an American company, and that's where the business gets grown.
Sold in their adolescence. Any other
Yes.
hard lessons? Your title says hard lessons in corporate governance. Any other hard lessons we've learned over the last handful of years?
I think the main lesson is everything we've tried to do in corporate governance turns out to be wrong. Like that's as hard a lesson as I can think of. It's a giant red F on our collective term papers. Um, there is a more subtle lesson, and that is everything we've done has been predicated on a belief that the most important thing we're going to do is restrain management, that corporate managers are always and everywhere unfaithful stewards of the shareholders' money, and that somehow markets don't constrain corporate behavior. Both of those are kind of crazy assumptions when you step back and look at them, but nearly everything we've done in corporate governance is based on those assumptions. So probably the hardest lesson is markets really constrain the amount of negligent misbehavior that a management team can get away with. They'll go out of business, and most managers work incredibly hard in a very disciplined way in order to exceed in those markets. And most corporate executives are trustworthy.
Interesting. Any other changes we could make that would improve things?
Well, probably if you're going to enumerate the most important change, it would be to get us generally get third parties out of the corporate governance
Consultants,
world. And
perhaps?
that includes getting the federal government, which has been making changes to the Business Corporations Act, get them out of it. It includes getting the securities commissions across Canada out of the corporate governance racket. And it includes maybe taking some steps to reduce the power of institutional shareholders and proxy advisors, to just generally get loudmouth third parties out of the business where they can control what happens inside companies.
This is a case, I think, of too many cooks in the kitchen, the corporate kitchen, let's call it. Ladies and gentlemen, that is Bryce Tingle. He's the author of Hard Lessons in Corporate Governance, and his book has been shortlisted for the Donner Book Prize. Bryce, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Harrison.